Currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Jackson Lab at Stanford University, Avni is focused on projects constraining global wetland CO2 and methane fluxes. In particular, she is synthesizing the magnitude and drivers of peatland ecosystem respiration globally. She is passionate about open science and harmonizing disparate data, and therefore thoroughly enjoys her role as a coordinator for the International Soil Carbon Network. Through this role, she connects diverse soil stakeholders to each other and to soil carbon data. In her free time, Avni is either cooking up a storm or binge-watching food videos to plan her next cooking adventure. Thanks again, Avni, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks everyone for being here. Let me just minimize this. Yeah, it's really exciting to be here, kicking off this new series. One silver lining of the pandemic has been this popping up of some excellent online seminar series, and this one seems particularly special. I see a lot of old and new peatland friends, and it's nice to connect with a lot of the Canadian peatland community. So really thanks a lot for putting this together. Special thanks to Rebecca, Lauren, and Mackenzie for doing all the legwork, and for David, and to all of you for being here. I know everybody's zoomed out these days. So as Rebecca said, my name is Avni Malhotra, and today I'll talk to you about climate change in peatlands and some above and below ground sort of perspectives. I really like this photo of peatland fine roots kind of intertwined around sphagnum that really give us a new perspective of what's going on in peatlands. And so before I start, I want to acknowledge two sets of co-authors for the two main studies that I'll be presenting today. And I also want to thank my lab group, so the Jackson Lab at Stanford University. It's a big bunch of awesome postdocs and grad students that are always available to help intellectually and morally. Here we definitely rented out or booked a conference room to have our Christmas karaoke party, much to the surprise of sort of passerbys. And then I also want to thank the Colleen Iverson's group at Oak Ridge National Lab, where I did a lot of the root study, well, all of the root study that I will present. And as part of that, there were many, many, many root pickers that helped us get through the samples, and this work wouldn't be possible without them as well. And of course, my funders. All right, so let's get right into it then. I know that or I expect that this, the crowd here doesn't need much convincing in terms of the importance of peatland biogeochemistry and peatlands in the global context. But as we often do, I'll just start with framing sort of the larger question on peatland and carbon change. And a lot of us that think about carbon in peatlands often wonder sort of broadly what the fate of this 1/3 of the world's low carbon will be. And there are tons of papers on this. Many of you in the audience have written some excellent papers. I just show one example because it wasn't possible to show many, but essentially depending on the peatland type or depending on the region, there have been reports of net carbon gains or losses in response to warming and global change. So we continue to kind of investigate this line of thinking. And the way that I always think about things is that vegetation plays a key role in peatland carbon balance. And this is framed a lot given my training in the McGill sort of peatland group, where we often thought about peatlands as they're represented in the Holocene peat model, which they always said very simply models peat accumulation based on the difference between production and decomposition, which are primarily based on the vegetation community, and the vegetation community is based on a function of climate as well. And so vegetation is a key piece of the puzzle, and this is true in other ecosystems as well, but in peatlands this is especially true because we know that there are strong ecohydrological feedbacks in peatlands. And so again, a lot of work has been done on this. I like to just kind of simplify it and look at this feedback in the sense that if you go off of a peatland's water table depth, which is a function of climate, often we find the vegetation composition is very closely related to that water table depth. The vegetation composition then determines the production and decomposition of the peatland, which of course is also related to climate. But the difference between this production and decomposition then tells you something about the carbon balance and the peat accumulation of that peatland. So given the strong eco-hydrological feedbacks, a lot of literature suggests that vegetation response and vegetation composition and traits above ground can really help us predict a lot about ecosystem function. On this slide, I'm just giving an example from a permafrost thaw system in northern Sweden, so Stordalen. Again, several of you are familiar with that site. But here we found that as permafrost thaws across this gradient, going from some of these low methane flux sites to all the way up here to really high methane flux habitats, the ratio between how much CO2 or methane is being produced really varies. And as permafrost thaws, there's this sort of nonlinear shift in this ratio. And the best predictor of this nonlinear shift was, in fact, the vegetation composition. So the sedge-dominated sites were on a completely different kind of trajectory in terms of CO2 to methane relationship relative to the other ones. So a lot of this work has been based on above ground plant community research, but what about below ground? So we know from upland literature that below ground responses might be more rapid than what we see above ground. And so in this review, Barjet et al. Suggests that global change responses on plant communities, of course, shift sort of above ground individual plant responses and reorder communities. But there's also this influence below ground where root traits, their plasticity changes and the distribution of root traits also changes. And we know that roots, especially fine roots, are closely tied to and regulate carbon and nutrient cycling, and that in turn feeds back to global change. So we do know there's not a huge body of literature, but there is work done in peatlands looking at roots and fine roots. And we know that fine roots are related to environmental gradients, but several gaps still remain in our understanding of how peatland fine roots respond to global change. In the backdrop here, you see some shrub fine roots that are, again, thinner than human hair, but also really beautiful. So from that sort of below ground question, let me just introduce the study site where we pursued this question at. So for those of you who don't know the Spruce experiment in Minnesota, this is a large Department of Energy funded, a very impressive infrastructure of experimental site. You can kind of see the aerial view here. So it's a full factorial design with 5 different levels of temperature treatment, as shown here, that are applied both above and below ground, as well as ambient and elevated CO2. And so within these large enclosures, a whole range of system properties are being measured. And so it was a real opportunity to work there and ask some of these below ground questions. So our question was really simple. What happens to fine roots in a warm peatland? We used an in-growth core method. And what that means really briefly is that we took these mesh cores that were installed down to a 30 or so centimeter depth. And within these cores, we filled them with industrial peat that we knew didn't have any roots in it. We left it in there for a whole season, and then we came back at the end of the season, collected the cores, and were able to quantify the amount of root, the amount of new root growth that had happened in each one of these temperature enclosures. And so we did this. We have data for this from 4 years. And this is still an ongoing study, so more data should be coming up in the future. And what was interesting about this first paper that we published from it is that we were able to capture sort of the different levels of the experimental treatment as Spruce was being turned on. So in 2014, only below ground warming had been turned on. Then the above ground warming treatment was turned on. And then in 2016 and 2017, elevated CO2 was turned on as well. So what happened to the fine roots? So on the y-axis here, you see fine root length production. The biomass numbers were similar, the trends were similar. I like showing the kilometer per meter square numbers because I find that they're sort of more impressive and easier to visualize. So if you think of sort of 10 kilometers per meter square of fine root under your feet in a peatland, that's a really powerful visualization, I think, rather than thinking about the biomass. So anyway, so on the x-axis here are the soil temperature treatments. And so here I'm regressing this against actual measured soil temperature. And also corresponding to that, we were able to get the soil moisture information. So as the peatland was warming, it was also drying as you go from sort of this higher number to lower number here. And so the overall kind of conclusion was that fine root length production was increasing in this ecosystem as it got warmer and warmer. So you're seeing sort of an order of magnitude increase in these fine root production numbers. And so those data that I just showed you were for the whole ecosystem. So that included trees, graminoid species, and shrubs. And then now I'm just going to focus on the shrub fine roots because those were the ones to respond the most within the ecosystem and had this dramatic sort of response of over a kilometer per meter square of shrub fine root increasing per degree Celsius of temperature. So that's a pretty dramatic increase given that the control numbers themselves were around a kilometer of meter square of fine root. And so from this part, we conclude that shrub fine roots may be faster to respond than the other ecosystem components, and this fits well with the paradigm from sort of upland ecosystems where it is suggested that thinner rooted species may increase their forage capacity by increasing root growth, whereas thicker rooted species like trees may be increasing their forage capacity by increasing mycorrhizal colonization. And so this line of research is still being pursued at Oak Ridge in the Iverson group, where they're continuing to look at sort of root and fungal interactions as the peatland warms. So again, many of us here have sort of a carbon perspective, and you might ask, okay, so you found all this dramatic increases in fine roots. What does this mean for the whole ecosystem sort of net carbon balance? So I know this is a busy slide, so let me just kind of walk you through it. So to answer that question, Paul Hansen in this recent publication put together all of the different components at Spruce into one kind of coherent story. And so here, you don't need to focus too much on all of the details here, but just kind of know that the top two panels deal with net primary production. So that that includes above and below ground production from trees, sphagnum, and shrubs. The red data points here are the root numbers that I presented. And then the bottom here panel is fluxes, so both CO2 and methane fluxes. And so the overall story that we saw was that there's a decrease or no change in tree productivity so far. There's an increase in shrub biomass, both above and below ground, as I presented. And perhaps because of this increase in shrubs, there was a drastic decrease in sphagnum abundance because they might be getting shaded out. And you can read more about that in Rich Norby's recent publication. And then overall, there was an increase in both CO2 and methane fluxes. So kind of to summarize that implication for net carbon balance, so far at Spruce, they find that relative to the pre-treatment net carbon exchange at Spruce, which suggested that Spruce was a net carbon sink. As it warms, we see over the 3 years that there is now an increased loss. So the system is switching from a sink to a source, essentially. And the data here kind of show all of the different years and all of the different treatments. And so from this part of my talk, I guess the main takeaways that I just want to highlight before I move on to another study are that peatland shrub pine roots increase dramatically with warming, and we might be unraveling this hidden mechanism for peatland shrubification that's often observed in the north. So it could be that because these shrub roots are able to rapidly adapt to changing environmental conditions, shrubs are the plant functional type that can still kind of persist in drier and warmer peatlands. This here is just a peatland meme, I guess, a root picking meme to distract you from my main point of how we go from a clump of peatland roots to a beautiful sort of shrub root over here. But going back to the point, so peatland shrub pine roots increase dramatically with warming and influence both the community composition of the entire ecosystem and also the net carbon balance downstream. All right, so that was one site and a very local example of how peatlands may be responding to climate change. But when I finished that project, I also wanted to kind of think more about peatland carbon cycling globally and started looking into sort of global databases where I could connect carbon cycling to plant traits. And so I haven't gotten very far on connecting it to plant traits, but I wanted to present some of the carbon cycle part of it first. So I looked to this global soil respiration database that Benmont Lamberty published almost 10 years ago now. And so this is a database that has chamber measurements of soil respiration globally. And so I was hoping to find numbers for peatlands in here, but when I looked in the database, I realized that a lot of the really wonderful literature from peatlands from the last few decades was not really represented. So Ben von Lamberty and I chatted about it, and we decided that we would compile a new database that would focus essentially on peatland data and not global data. So we took his template and I added a bunch of the peatland-centric variables and now have this compiled database of peatland ecosystem respiration measurements. So these are CO2 emissions measured using dark chambers, essentially. And I call it the Peatland Ecosystem or PETER database. And so far we have about 100 unique lat-long locations in this database. There's a whole range of variables, but the key one that we focus on is ecosystem respiration in grams of carbon per meter square per year. So these are annual estimates, so we don't have too much information about sort of the sub-annual trends in this. Across biomes, you can see as you go from Arctic to tropical, there's an increase in ecosystem respiration, both in the mean and the variability. And so let's get into some analyses from these databases. So we looked at predictors of peatland ecosystem respiration first, and we found that across a range of different predictors that we could possibly regress ecosystem respiration with, some of the energy and the vegetation categories were often the strongest bivariate predictors. So the x-axis here is just a simple correlation coefficient. So a lot of the vegetation proxies from gridded data sets ended up being important. GPP was important. We also found that peat depth was weakly, but still interestingly related to ecosystem respiration. So we went from this kind of bivariate type exploration to then looking at multiple regressions and other more complicated models to come up with the best sort of predictive model of peatland ecosystem respiration. And we picked a model that included gross primary productivity, mean annual precipitation, and shortwave solar radiation. That was one of our best fit models. And so going forward, I'll explain to you how we did some upscaling and future projections. And so we used that same simple linear regression equation that I showed you. that includes mean annual precipitations, shortwave solar radiation, and GPP. We use some gridded data sets from ERA 5 and MODIS. We basically upscaled and had peatland ecosystem respiration numbers for the entire globe. And then we applied the peatland extent mask from Hugelius et al. That came out this year. And then we did some future projections using CMIP5 and RCP 4.5 to mid-century. And so at this juncture, I also want to thank my really awesome colleagues here in the Jackson Lab, Sarah Ferran and Zitao Yang. They're also postdocs with me and have some excellent geospatial and CMIP skills. So we've been working on this together, and that's been really awesome. And so the next few slides that I present are definitely work in progress. So the numbers might change a bit, but we're pretty confident that we're on the right track. But hopefully I can get some community feedback on this stuff as well. So upscaling. So we upscaled ecosystem respiration for peatlands north of 23 degrees north. And this number is simply because the Hugelius map is north of 23 north. So that's kind of a caveat to keep in mind. So here you can see kind of the regional trends in ecosystem respiration from peatlands. I wouldn't focus too much kind of on the regional differences so far. I think the big picture right now is that we can come up with a total peatland ecosystem respiration number, which is about 1.2 petagrams of carbon per year. And then we can think about how this number changes in the future with different scenarios. So we find that there's a 27% increase in peatland ecosystem respiration by the 2046 to 2055 period relative to present, which is 1980 to 2016. Here in the two panels, you can see the absolute change in ecosystem respiration in this period, or the percent change in ecosystem respiration in this period. Again, this was RCP 4.5. And then the next question you might ask is, okay, well, if it's changing in the future, what is causing this change? And so we did some attribution analyses of these projected changes, and so far we find that GPP has the highest influence on the future increases. So the panels here show, if you keep all else equal, what is the influence of GPP on sort of the future ER. So for example, GPP is causing about a 30 gram carbon per meter square per year change in, say, the Hudson Bay lowlands. And so let's kind of recap some of the key numbers that I just went over. So the top row here are the numbers that I've already presented to you. So we use the data-driven empirical model from the database using some of the gridded data sets, and we come up with a present peatland ecosystem respiration number of 1.2 petagrams. We find that this will increase 27% to 1.5 petagrams by mid-century. And then the other interesting thing is the second row that I want to present to you, where instead of using the data-driven empirical model and grids, we just went to these GCMs. So we used, so like I said, and I can discuss these details more. So we used CMIP5, we used a multi-model mean of 10 different GCMs. And so we can also just get autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration outputs from these GCMs. And we find that they overestimate both the reference and the future period of peatland respiration. So that was an interesting finding that I would like to kind of think a little bit more about. But let me just summarize this part of my talk here. So essentially, I'm presenting this first estimate of peatland ecosystem respiration globally, which is about 1.2 petagrams. And so it's interesting to compare it to the global soil respiration estimates that are about 88 petagrams. So 1.2 is a pretty small number compared to 88 petagrams. But when you compare the carbon pool that peatlands hold, we know that it's 1/3 of the global sort of pool. So that's interesting that peatlands are a big carbon pool and a small ecosystem respiration CO2 source. So effectively, they are able to kind of contain that carbon pool pretty well so far. But what happens in the future? Well, perhaps a 27% increase in this. The question then is, will this 27% increase switch this current peatland sink to a source? And so this peatland sink number of 0.1 petagram comes also from the Helios paper. And then if there are going to be these changes and they are attributable to GPP, we know from our previous example in spruce that increases in GPP are not just simple, right? So there isn't just an increase. So if there's a shrub GPP increase in peatlands, that doesn't just mean a GPP increase. It also means potential dynamic vegetation changes, and perhaps sphagnum, the key ecosystem engineer, also gets lost in the meantime. So those are some kind of pending questions that we can continue to explore. And then lastly, the point I made about GCMs potentially overestimating peatland ecosystem respiration. I don't think this comes as a surprise to many of us, because we know that GCMs often don't have a peatland PFD or any sort of peatland representation. But can we kind of diagnose this a little bit further and understand why this might be happening? And also, what can we do about it? So one pitch that I kind of want to make to the community is that maybe if we better represent peatland data in global databases, this might help us try to get a better peatland representation in GCMs. So in the last part of my talk, I'll just kind of discuss that as a pitch and as an idea. And so just to set up some context for that again, remember that the peatland SOC pool in the context of the global SOC pool is only 500, or sorry, is 500 versus perhaps the 2,300 petagram of global SOC pool. So it's not a negligible number, right? So we often say 1/3, up to 1/3 of the global soil carbon. But the issue is that these two SOC pools are often studied by very different research communities. And these data, or data related to peatland SOC pools, are often housed in different databases as well. So again, the pitch that I'm making is that perhaps increasing peatland data in global databases could help us improve model representation and benchmarking of peatlands. So essentially, that's the last few slides that I'm going to present about putting peatland carbon pools and fluxes on the map in the global context. So I'll talk both about pools and fluxes, but through my work in the International Soil Carbon Network, we think a lot about sort of the hierarchy of data needs to understand the vulnerability of this global SOC pool. And we know that we need also, different tiers of data to understand the vulnerability. We must also understand sort of the change, the baseline change and the future change of this SOC. And then underpinned on that, we must first also just understand the basic spatial variability in the stock. And as you go from bottom to top of this pyramid, we kind of decrease in data availability and current understanding. So this is kind of the global picture, but what about peatlands? So if you look at the landscape of SOC databases globally, soil organic carbon databases globally, there are several to consider. So again, this is a very busy slide and there's a bunch of acronym soups here. So don't worry too much about the acronyms. The point that I want to make is that we are starting to have more and more data from wetlands and peatlands be represented in these different data sets, but not always. So for example, WOSIS, which is the UN FAO's database of soil carbon, and is used to produce this gridded product called soil grids, didn't have too much of a representation of peatland soils in it. And soil grids is often used for Earth system model benchmarking. And now I think in their most recent version, they have done a great job of kind of improving wetland soil representation and dealing with some of the bulk density issues that they have. So we're starting to get there, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting peatland data into these global databases. So that was all pools. Let me also just touch quickly in a couple of slides on fluxes. So for fluxes, starting with CO2 flux. I won't talk about eddy covariance tower fluxes because there's a great sort of well-organized community on that, and those data are relatively well archived. But in terms of chamber CO2 data, I already mentioned the two. I mentioned sort of the database that I'm leading, and I also mentioned the soil respiration database. And now, just very recently, I think 2 days ago, this other exciting database just came online. It's called COSOR, and it holds continuous measurements of chamber CO2 fluxes. So check that out. We still have a lot of work to do in that. It has about 83 sites, I think, out of which only 4 are wetlands. But we still already have this amazing infrastructure with which to kind of build off of and look at peatland and wetland fluxes in the context of all of these other types of ecosystems. And then for methane fluxes, I think that chamber data from organic soils is super well organized and synthesized, and that's also a lot of credit goes to the Catchment and Wetland Science Group and a lot of the old synthesis work done by David. And then in terms of eddy covariance data for fluxes, another exciting database that just became available online to mention would be the FluxNet methane community product that you can go check out at this link. So this is being put together with a bunch of folks in my lab. Kyle Delwich is about to submit a paper on this as well, and there's a great representation of peatlands in this paper, and so then we can start to look at the sort of functional relationships between methane fluxes and environment and where peatlands lie along this sort of continuum of ecosystems. And then don't forget that ultimately, one day, the point of all of this is then to also be able to look at these data and these ecosystems and kind of understand their plant traits and then link global change, vegetation, and fluxes. And so I'm starting to do some of that work with this database and trying to classify the different vegetation types in this database as well. All right, so let me wrap up, just looking at the time now. So I presented a lot of stuff, and if you want just kind of the key take-home messages, there are 2 main ones. So the first one is that peatland vegetation is closely linked to its carbon cycling, and some of these hidden below-ground responses might elucidate some new mechanisms in our understanding of peatland response to global change. And so I gave you some examples of this on the global scale. We find that plant productivity is a dominant predictor of both present and future peatland ecosystem respiration. But when we look in the site, sort of local scale at the spruce site, we found that the story is more complicated than just GPP increases influencing the carbon cycling, right? So there's these nuances where peatland shrub pine roots increase dramatically in the ecosystem and influence downstream community composition and net carbon balance. So that was point 1. And then the second point I made, thinking about why GCMs may not be representing peatlands as well as they could, was to make the pitch that we should improve data and thus model representation of peatlands in the global context. And there are lots of exciting new developments in terms of global carbon pool and flux databases. So we should keep an eye out on those and use those as well as contribute our PD data to either directly to the databases or get our data in repositories. So I'll end there. I can leave the slide up and happy to go back and forth to any of the different ones for questions. Thanks for listening.